We'll go ahead and get started, and I'll let anyone else in as we continue through the session. But otherwise, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Connecticut River Joint Commissions for tonight's presentation on floodplain management in the Connecticut River. The CRJC is a quasi-governmental organization composed of governor-appointed and designated commissioners from Vermont and New Hampshire, and the parent organization to 5 local river subcommittees. They may represent different interests, but are united in a shared regard of the Connecticut River, the surrounding landscape, and the ecosystem as a whole. Together, they identify and pursue collaborative efforts that safeguard the valley. Today, we'll be hearing from 2 knowledgeable experts from New Hampshire and Vermont. Karina Dailey is a restoration ecologist with the Vermont Natural Resources Council. She joined VNRC in April 2020. As restoration ecologist, she is responsible for running VNRC's dam removal program and contributing her scientific knowledge and expertise to policy issues around conservation and the restoration of Vermont's waters. Most recently, Dailey was senior ecologist at Trudell Consulting Engineers in Williston, overseeing natural resource-related projects and providing testimony for Act 250 and Act 248 land use permitting projects. Formerly, Dailey was a project manager for the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District and a restoration ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Interville Nursery. Before moving to Vermont, she taught environmental science and worked in conservation in the greater Yellowstone area in Wyoming. Jennifer Gilbert is a resilience project manager with the NHDES Coastal Program. Prior to joining NHDES in August 2023, Jennifer was the State Floodplain Management Coordinator and was in that position since 2005. In her previous role, Jennifer provided technical assistance, outreach, and training to various stakeholders about floodplain regulations, floodplain mapping, flood insurance, and flood hazard mitigation. In addition, she provided post-disaster assistance and support to communities and property owners. In her current role, she provides technical assistance and outreach to assist state agencies, coastal municipalities, and other stakeholders understand and incorporate coastal floodplain management higher standards and best available coastal flood risk science and decision-making. At the end of this session, we will have a Q&A where you'll be able to ask your questions. In the meantime, we ask that you remain muted for the duration of the session and know that this session is being recorded so that it can be shared with other members after today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and welcome Jennifer.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I will be talking about the floodplain management and the National Flood Insurance Program and kind of how we can use that program to help understand and deal with flood risk. So to start, as you know from the introduction, I currently work at the DES Coastal Program here in New Hampshire. Obviously, I'm not talking in that role. I'm more talking in my former role as the state floodplain coordinator for New Hampshire for the last 18 years prior to leaving last year. All right, so just a brief overview of some of the things that I'll be talking about during my session. Just a brief overview of the NFIP. Not sure how many people are already familiar with that, but I'll be going through that pretty quickly. Talking briefly about floodplain maps, floodplain regulations, the community rating system, ending with flood insurance and some resources to finish out my session. All right, so the National Flood Insurance Program was created back in 1968, essentially to address the issues that were happening back then with dealing with flooding. There was no maps, there was no flood insurance. There was a lot of damage happening as a result of storms, and the federal government stepped in to address it. And over 50 years later, we are still working within that same program. It's a voluntary partnership between FEMA and communities that volunteer to participate in the program. It's not required, and communities can choose to participate. It's really broken down into 3 parts. It's knowing your risk through the floodplain maps, reducing your risk through floodplain regulations, and insuring your risk through flood insurance. So as I'll be talking during the presentation, obviously my expertise is in New Hampshire. I do have some familiarity with Vermont and I have worked with the state coordinator, Rebecca, over the years. But I'll be talking in general, but highlighting some parts of New Hampshire. So for participation in New Hampshire, we have 222 communities that participate, or 94%. That map on the right there indicates in white where those communities that participate in the program. The ones in orange and yellows are the ones that do not participate. So we have quite a good deal of participation. And again, a community agrees to adopt and enforce local floodplain regulations. In return, FEMA offers the NFIP flood insurance, which is available for all residents and business owners and renters within those communities that are shown in white. Whether or not they're in the floodplain or not, it's eligible. They are eligible to get that flood insurance. FEMA oversees the National Flood Insurance Program, so they have a role in this program. They're the ones that make the flood insurance available. They're the ones that deal with the mapping the floodplains. They have oversight of the program itself. They establish the standards that communities must enforce at a minimum, and they monitor compliance within the communities to ensure everyone's doing what they need to be doing. The state plays a role as well. Each of the states receive a grant from FEMA to administer the program. And the state's role is really to provide technical assistance to all stakeholders, whether it's residents, surveyors, real estate agents, insurance agents. The state kind of covers all of that information about the National Flood Insurance Program. Providing education and outreach is a key piece as well, developing model floodplain regulations, taking the regulations that are in the Code of Federal Regulations and putting them into a model ordinance for communities to easily use and to adopt, and assisting communities in evaluating compliance of floodplain activities and providing assistance during post-disaster situations. The local role is a little bit more robust because it's basically down to the communities to administer these regulations, to have a permitting process in place. They need to understand communities' regulations and the FEMA maps because those are key components of administering the program. Ensuring that all local permits in special flood hazard areas are applied for. Reviewing and processing permit applications for floodplain development. Ensuring floodplain development is built according to the permits and to their floodplain regulations, and taking enforcement and correcting violations as needed. So the local role, though they have to meet minimum standards, it's really a program that communities can really customize to address the flood risk within the community itself. So floodplain mapping. This is a good starting point for knowing an area's flood risk is to review the FEMA floodplain maps. If you're familiar with the floodplain maps, you know they have their limitations and they are definitely not perfect. But as I said, they're a good starting point in determining an area's risk. The FEMA maps show the 1% annual chance flood, which means there's a 1% chance of happening in any given year. This is the national standards that have been established for the National Flood Insurance Program. Although it's noted that larger and more severe floods can and do happen, as well as smaller and less severe floods. So this map doesn't always represent what is actually going to be happening during a 1% chance flood. This flood is also commonly called the base flood or the 100-year flood. It's a term we're trying to get away from because it's always a misconception that it's a flood that happens once every 100 years, but certainly that is not true. An example in New Hampshire here is we had back-to-back floods in 2006 and 2007, and I heard a lot of reports that it must have been 100 years in 2007, because there was another event that was at that level, the 1% chance flood. So the floodplain mapping is consists of the flood insurance rate map that FEMA puts together. It shows the flood zones. It shows those base flood elevations, which are those numbers that you might see up on the map there. This is the proposed elevation that 1% chance flood is expected to rise to during such an event. It's the standard that's used for regulation purposes, as I'll be talking about shortly. It also shows the regulatory floodway, which is the red striped area, which includes the water course and sometimes the adjacent floodplain. This, of course, is the most dangerous and deepest part of the floodwaters during a 1% chance flood. So there's more restrictions located within that area, simply just because it's not a good place to be building. The flood insurance study is a detailed study that goes along with the maps. The maps are basically a graphical representation of the data that's included in the flood insurance study. The flood insurance study includes the flood analysis that's used to prepare the maps. It also includes important tables and charts that include also base flood elevation and how those are derived. As far as to find the floodplain maps and to determine a property's flood risk, there's a couple different sources. The FEMA Map Service Center is certainly the one-stop key online repository for historic, preliminary, and effective flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance studies, as well as the place to download the GIS data of the floodplain maps. In New Hampshire, we have a mapping viewer online called the New Hampshire Flood Hazards Viewer. It works pretty much like Google Maps. You can enter an address and it'll take you to that location. It contains the same FEMA mapping layers, as well as state contour data and parcel boundaries in most areas of the state. New Hampshire also has Granite View, which is done through the University of New Hampshire. And this is also a good resource for overlaying with other New Hampshire specific data. Along with the map, they are slowly being updated over the years. Congress allocates a certain amount of money towards floodplain mapping, and that then gets distributed across the country into the 10 FEMA regional areas. Here in FEMA Region 1, which is New England, we tend to get the least amount because we just don't compare to like FEMA Region 4, which includes Florida and the other southeastern states that experience much larger and more frequent flood events. So it's a lot of the issues that we have with our maps is a lot of them have not been updated since the 1970s or 1980s. And here in New Hampshire, we haven't had a lot of floodplain mapping since probably 2013, but now FEMA is starting to work again. I know Vermont was not as lucky as New Hampshire as far as getting maps in previous years. So Vermont is also getting a lot of revised maps. So many of the maps are being updated, are being done on a watershed basis now. And once those are completed, they'll update the current county maps that are available. Unfortunately, because of the limited funding, only a limited number of watercourses are updated during a mapping process. So we continue to live with mapping that has floodplains that are way out of date, just because development continues to go on and changes things in those watersheds. So those maps aren't as perfect as they should be. And here in New Hampshire, one benefit that we have with the new maps that are slowly coming out is they're utilizing the statewide elevation data that was gathered through a process called LIDAR. And that's certainly going to help provide more accurate delineations of the floodplain boundaries in New Hampshire than what was done previously. So some key mapping takeaways is everyone lives in an area with some flood risk, whether it's low, moderate, or high. Low is generally considered outside of the map floodplain area, that area outside of the colored area, which is known as the Zone X area. Moderate is known as the 0.2% flood or 500-year flood, and it's delineated in the orange areas. And of course, the high risk areas are the 1% chance floods, which include those blue areas along with the reds diagonal lined floodways. The maps are created with past data, as I mentioned before, so it doesn't account for any future conditions. And simply, Mother Nature doesn't read maps. Floodwaters will go past the line on a map. They won't follow that line. So that's always a good reminder that even if you're outside of that, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be impacted by flooding. One way communities can help reduce flood risks to their community and to their residents is through floodplain regulations. So as I mentioned, communities have to adopt and enforce minimum standards into floodplain regulations for a community to participate in the program. States have put together model floodplain ordinances that help communities determine what regulations to adopt. Many states have adopted not only the minimum requirements, but also higher standards, those standards that go above and beyond. And I know Vermont has some really great model floodplain ordinances available for communities. New Hampshire does as well. When I was in my position, we had put together a higher standards ordinance as well as a minimum standard ordinance for communities to look at. And we recommend communities really just look at what type of risk that they have. There are some communities that just are not high at risk, where others experience risk flooding and are at risk more frequently. Just to review some just very brief regulations that are contained in those is communities have to make sure that any development in those special flood areas are designed and adequately anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement. That's certainly the case, especially for manufactured homes or any other accessory structures that are more prone to be moved during a flood event. Certainly, if things are going to get wet, so you need to make sure they're constructed with flood resistant materials and just using methods and practices to minimize flood damage. The key requirement is for all new construction or substantial improvements, which I'll talk about in the next slide, is that the lowest floor needs to be elevated to that base flood elevation, that expected height that the 1% chance flood is expected to rise to. I know in New Hampshire, our state building code through the International Code Council, which is for the 2018 version, does require that lowest floor to be elevated 1 foot, at least 1 foot above that base flood elevation, which gives it an additional level of safety. That's also known as a freeboard requirement. Substantial improvement and substantial damage, which I'll be talking briefly about, is a key component as well. Here in New England, we've had a lot of building done in the floodplain areas before there were maps, before there were floodplain regulations. So these structures were built in a way that was not designed to protect them from flooding. So substantial improvement and substantial damage is a way to help bring those structures into compliance. Because through substantial improvement, someone is putting a certain amount of money into improving that structure. So the requirement is that if they meet a certain threshold of improving that structure, they're going to need to bring that structure into compliance to help protect that new investment. So the total cost of any improvements, whether it's within the existing footprint of the structure or including any additions to that structure, if the total costs are greater than or equal to 50% of the market value of just the structure, does not include the land, then that's when that structure would be required to be brought into compliance. Substantial damage is very similar to improvements. It's the total cost of restoring the structure to its before damage condition are greater than or equal to 50% of the market value. And I know that substantial damage can be very difficult, especially after a big event. People just want to rebuild and get back to where they want to, how they were before. But we have to take the time to assess whether or not they are substantially damaged, because then they would need to be brought into compliance and hopefully be further protected down the line. And the other key thing about substantial damage is it can be damage of any origin. It does not have to be because of a flood. I worked with property owners that had a fire or a pipe burst, and they were in the special flood hazard area, and they were determined to be substantially damaged. Again, it's just a way to help better protect that structure from future flood damage. Substantial improvement and substantial damage determinations are done by the community. They have to review the cost, determine the market value. And again, if that's brought into compliance, then, or if it's determined to be substantially improved or damaged, it has to be brought into compliance. So FEMA NFIP regulations are a good start, but buildings can still suffer damage. They don't address changes to the floodplain areas that are shown on the maps. They don't address events that are greater than the 1% chance flood. As I mentioned, they don't address future conditions. If there's going to be more precipitation, how do we deal with more water than what it was expected, as shown on the maps? So communities can choose to adopt higher standards that go beyond the minimum requirements. As I mentioned, New Hampshire has adopted model ordinance that has higher standards, as well as Vermont. In addition, in New Hampshire, we also created a higher floodplain regulation standards menu options. These are for the communities that really don't want to adopt a kind of a blanket model floodplain ordinance with all kinds of higher standards. This is kind of a pick and choose menu, if you can say, of just trying to address the specific risks that they may have. You may have one community that has a lot of development in place. So they may be looking at maybe compensatory storage to help offset that flood storage. Whatever is put in, an equal amount is taken out. Some communities have done that. Some communities have a lot of development and have experienced a lot of flooding, and so maybe they'll prohibit any new buildings being built in the special flood hazard area because they just don't have the capacity to put somebody at risk in the floodplain. They really need those floodplains to be working as they're expected to be used for, and that's to help discharge that flood during that event. So we have several communities in New Hampshire, as you can see from that map. The ones in green are ones that enforce floodplain regulations. Many of them have that freeboard, that elevation above that base flood elevation, prohibiting uses, setback requirements, buffers. These are all great methods to help increase a community's resistance to flood risk resiliency. And one way that FEMA kind of rewards communities that go above and beyond those minimum standards or those minimum activities that they need to do is through the community rating system, which is a voluntary incentive program for communities to participate in. Communities earn points based on what certain floodplain activities that they're enforcing in their community or doing in their community. And in return, the policy owner can receive a certain percent discount off of their flood insurance policy. New Hampshire, I know Vermont has a few communities, and here in New Hampshire, we have 5 communities. Most are in the southwestern part of our state. Keene, Marlborough, Nashua, Peterborough, and Winchester. All communities except for Winchester are at a class 8 that provide a 10% discount. Winchester is at a class 9, which provides a 5% discount. So certainly there's a lot of talk about flood insurance, and I recognize that it can be expensive. But we always recommend that it's good for people to talk to their insurance agents and talk about any possible options to reduce the premium. Especially if you're not being required by your lender to have flood insurance. There are different ways that people can look at doing to the flood insurance policy to help reduce that premium. Certainly a higher deductible, or reducing the amount of coverage or contents, or releasing the contents coverage. But the important thing too also to remember about flood insurance is anywhere it can rain, it can flood. And as long as your community participates, residents, businesses, renters have that option of getting NFIP flood insurance. Most homeowners and renters insurance generally do not cover damage that's as a result of a flood, which is a defined term. And flood insurance can pay regardless of a presidential disaster declaration, especially for individual assistance, which covers private property owners. Here in New Hampshire, we have not seen a declaration for individual assistance since the 2005, 2006, and 2007 flood events. All of ours have been related to public assistance, which helps address infrastructure and community roads and things like that. But as far as property owners and their structures, that individual assistance hasn't been there just because we haven't qualified. We haven't had the widespread flooding that we did back in the early 2000s. Just to give you some quick statistics about flood insurance in New Hampshire, we're about just under 6,000 policies. And just to note, this is data from about 6 months ago. Generally, it doesn't change that much, but this just gives you an overall overview of kind of where we're at in New Hampshire as far as flood insurance policies. All right, so just to wrap up, again, I am no longer the state floodplain coordinator. That position is actually vacant at the moment. But that the state floodplain program is part of the Department of Business and Economic Affairs through the Office of Planning and Development. So there's a lot of wealth of information on the website there. Once they have somebody back, hopefully they'll be starting up the Floodlines Quarterly newsletter that I started back in 2007, which generally provides a lot of information to communities and to whoever about floodplain management. And if you're interested in just learning more about floodplain management, floodplain maps, we have a lot of training recordings and training modules on the Office of Planning and Development's YouTube page. So feel free to check that out. So I am finishing up now, and I appreciate your time listening. And we will be, I'm supposed to remind you that we will have a Q&A session after we're done. All right, so I am going to stop sharing now and pass it off to Karina.
Hi, everyone. Hold on a sec while I bring up my presentation. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. That was really interesting to hear. I'm in Vermont, so it's good to hear what's going on in New Hampshire as well. So thank you for that. So my presentation is about dam removal. I work for VNRC as a restoration ecologist. VNRC is Vermont Natural Resources Council. And a good portion of my job is managing the dam removal program for VNRC. And I also chair something called the Vermont Dam Task Force, which I will talk about in a little bit. But I'll go through my slides and we can have a conversation at the end with if questions come up. Now I need to figure out how to move forward. There we go. And just to help this conversation, there's a number of folks working on dam removal in Vermont. I am not the only one, but my job at VNRC is a statewide organization in Vermont. So I do support dam removals all over the state. This being said, there's a lot of really great people in the Connecticut River watershed that are doing dam removals, Connecticut River Conservancy, White River Partnership, and a lot of the conservation districts. So I help support those folks, but a lot of my funding is tied to the Lake Champlain Basin side of the state. So that's where I tend to do more of the actual project management work on dam removals, because there are less project managers that are willing to manage those projects on that side of the state. So as part of the Vermont Dam Task Force, which is just a group of interested citizens, scientists, regulators who come together to support dam removal, to raise awareness, identify derelict dams that are good candidates for removal, prioritize those dams, and collaborate together on how to move them forward. And yeah, we have like over 60 people on our listserv, and we meet every other month, and it's been a really successful way to come together, both hybrid and so Zoom and in person, and we do field trips to dam removal sites and talk about them. A little, I think it helps in understanding the benefits of dam removal to understand the science behind why we are doing this work. And that is really to understand the importance of our natural infrastructure as our best defense moving forward for climate resilience. And when a dam is in a river, it disrupts the river's process. So rivers are a free-flowing system that need to constantly move, and that's called the river continuum concept. So rivers the health of a river depends on flow, it depends on habitat, and it depends on biota. So we need those things. When you put a barrier across that system, it changes the system. So really it changes the ecosystem from a free-flowing river to a pond or a reservoir. And when you put a barrier in a river, all of that sediment and nutrients and water that would normally flow downstream builds up behind the dam. That causes a temperature change and an ecosystem change. So you, instead of having cold water fish species, which Vermont and New Hampshire are known for, brook trout being one of them, you have warm water fish species like bass and sunfish. So and the vegetation types change as well as the algae and other organisms. So a really different system. And of course, all dams are different. So, you know, I'm just speaking generally of how a dam affects a river system. Additionally, they block, you know, those fish ability to move up and downstream to seek refuge. So when fish and other aquatic organisms are migrating, they need to have access to cold water refugia for habitat, for spawning, for foods, to seek food sources when temperatures warm up. That's really critically important. Some other facts about dams: they cost a lot of money to maintain, so they aren't something that lasts forever. And a lot of our dams in New England were built a long time ago, and they were built in a time when we needed that energy along the river for the small mills that it powered. And a lot of those dams are no longer used. They've been abandoned and they haven't been maintained. So they're a liability because they are not only impacting the environment, but if they were to fail in a storm event, they could cause a public safety risk downstream to neighbors and landowners. A little bit about project selection. So there's over 1,000 dams in Vermont, and at this point, none of these projects move fast. It's about 3 years to remove a dam. It takes a long time, so we want to make sure we're trying to remove the ones that will provide the most benefit. So we look at ecological impact of the dam, and we have the Nature Conservancy worked with Vermont in 2017 and created a dam screening tool. And that tool sort of looked at like 17 different variables, ecological variables, and put them into a model and prioritize dam removal projects based on that. So that's one tool we have in our toolbox. That tool is, I think, probably more specific to the Lake Champlain Basin than the Connecticut River side. So it needs to be updated. It's a static tool, but it's one tool. The hazard classification of a dam. So there is a hazard rating for all licensed dams in the state, and that hazard classification definitely has an impact on if it's an abandoned dam that is a high hazard rating. That's a dam that we would prioritize for removal. We can't remove a dam. We can have, the highest priority ecologically beneficial dam to remove, and we have a landowner that isn't willing. And if you have a landowner that isn't willing, we can't remove the dam. So obviously, landowner interest is huge. And none of these projects are successful without multiple partners. So the more people who are involved in the project, it obviously slows the project down, but it ultimately makes the project stronger. So often, I'll get invited into a community that has a failing dam and they're concerned about it, particularly after the flooding this summer in Vermont. We had a lot of damage to our dams. And the community isn't ready to let it go. They love their pond, or they just love the wildlife value, and they have a hard time thinking about that change. So sometimes it's just an educational piece, and they have to make the decision together as a community. So it can take a lot of time to build that support and teach the educational benefits of dam removal. Some of the common dam failures, this is from a FEMA PDF. There's a lot, depends on the dam. There's so many different kinds of dams, but concrete failure, cracking of the dam, erosion behind the dam. A lot of the earthen dams, people have let trees grow up on them. You can't let trees grow on a dam if you want to maintain the safety of your dam. Rodent activity, and stability failure from underneath. So often there can be scouring underneath and erosion underneath the dam. I'm just gonna go through a few different projects that we've recently completed and sort of talk of them as different case study examples to share with you. This is a dam in Rutland, Vermont, right in the city of Rutland on Tenny Brook. It's called Dunkley Dam, and this dam was removed in 2021 after we had to evacuate the neighbors. There's a lot of housing right next to this dam. 9 times the fire department had to evacuate the homeowners in 3 different housing complexes right there due to flooding from this dam. So this was a dam that the community was in full support of removing. In 2019, there was a huge storm event in October, and at that time there was another evacuation, and at that point they performed an emergency breach on the dam to mitigate some of the impact immediately, and then we worked to raise the funds to remove it 2 years later. But this dam has a ton of history. It started out as an old mill dam. I think it made dowels. It was a dowel mill. And then it was an ice pond, so they harvested ice out of it. Then it was a recreational swimming pond and hockey rink for the city of Rutland. And then it was abandoned and not maintained for I think it was from 1920 until the 2020s. But what's also important, and that I like to share with people, is to think about the dam, think about the river before the dam, and for 10,000 years it was a free-flowing river. So yes, it's a big change from what you've been looking at for the past 50 years, or what the community has looked at, for the past couple hundred years. But before that, a river flowed freely for a much longer time. So this sign is just an image that sort of tells the story of the whole history of the waterway and the changing times, which I think is really important. And this is required as part of the historic preservation compliance. This is another dam in Castleton, Vermont, Pelletier Dam. This one, so this is a before and after picture of the same area. The picture on the left is the dam in place, and then the picture on the right is the same, from the same location with the dam removed in the free-flowing river post removal. This was a marble dam, so this was an old marble mill, and in fact, like, oxen hauled the marble from a bigger river up to this dam in ox carts to build the dam. So it was a really beautiful dam. As you can see, there's silt basically right up to the top of it. So it had silted in. Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department actually owned it, so this was a state-owned dam. They had purchased it after it was an abandoned marble mill, and they had thought that it would be a good fishing pond, recreational area. This being said, it silted in and never served that purpose, because when you own a dam, and you have to maintain it if you're going to use it for something. So, typically with our flood control dams in the state, we dredge behind those dams because of all that sediment that's coming downstream that builds up. If we don't take that sediment out, obviously we don't have the storage for a reservoir or a flood control area. So this dam didn't serve that purpose, but it was the river that it's on, North Breton Brook, was an amazing brook trout fishery, and brown trout as well. So there's wild brown trout and wild native brook trout in this stream above and below the dam. And removing this dam was reconnecting 37 miles of brook trout habitat. So a big area, which provides more genetic diversity to the species, more cold water coming downstream, so more nutrients moving up and down. So a huge fish benefit here. Additionally, there's a big wetland complex upstream with a lot of beavers, and this project involved a wetlands restoration and floodplain restoration piece, as well as just the dam removal. So it was a good opportunity to think about dam removals as not just removing the dam, but building in a larger restoration component to it. So we restored almost 2 acres of wetlands. Much of that was floodplain as well. And I think 1,800 linear feet of river stream bed. This is a dam in Shrewsbury, Vermont, Connolly Pond Dam. We removed this dam last year. This is an example of an old earthen dam. So these dams were built actually by NRCS, or funded by NRCS in the 1950s, to provide water supply for livestock or fire suppression. So this is like a 300-foot long, 15-foot wide earthen dam. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the photo, that's the outlet, and all those trees is the dam face. This dam was failing because of all those trees on the dam. And it is above a road and a house. So it was considered a high hazard dam. We had to do an emergency drawdown to remove the water and divert the water around before we were able to remove the dam. So this is a drone footage of the drawdown before we actually removed the dam and reconnected the channel. But even just, I love this picture because it shows all of the wetland seeps, the spring seeps that are flowing into this. This is a high headwater stream up high in Shrewsbury, and all of the spring seeps that are feeding this tributary. So all of that cold water, groundwater discharge, wetlands, bounced right back up after having been in a pond inundated state for, over, I think 70 years or something. So they really bounced back. And because of that, we tried to not do a lot with this dam removal. So some dam removals require a lot of excavation of sediment behind the dam and a lot of channel restoration. This project, because of these spring seeps and the natural revegetation that came back so strongly after the drawdown, we really just improved the outlet. So right there, where the water's flowing downstream at the dam face, we restored that outlet and let the channel, we're letting the channel move back and forth until it finds, its historic pattern or where it wants to be within this wetland. We did take some of the earth and material from the dam where we removed it and put it back. You could actually see the old contour lines of where the soil had been taken from to build the dam and put it back in those locations. So this is a pretty passive dam removal project and kind of a good example of that. This is the dam in Northfield, Cross Brothers Dam, that we have yet to remove. It's been on the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program for 4 years. And we really hope that we'll be hearing from FEMA very soon about supporting funding to remove this dam. We keep getting glimmers of hope. But yeah, this is a dam. So this is a dam in the channel. It was breached in like the 1970s to lower the flood elevation for the town of Northfields, because this is right in the town. There's a Dollar General off to the right in these photos. And we have evidence based on our benefit cost analysis and our flood inundation preliminary design analysis that removing this dam will lower the base flood elevation for 10 homes upstream of this dam that typically flood. So 10 homes that are within the floodplain. So that's significant, and this dam is going to cost approximately, we've had a quote of about $1 million to remove it, but $1 million to lower the flood elevation for 10 homes versus buying out those 10 homes is a lot more affordable. So we really do hope that this project moves forward. And this is a town-owned dam. The town of Northfield owns this. They're in full support. They're chomping at the bit, in fact, to remove it. It's also a very well-known brook trout fishery, so there's a ton of other benefits. This is a rendering on the right-hand side of what it would look like with the dam removed, and the left-hand side has the dam in the lower portion of the picture. So often when we're working with communities and they want to have a sense of what it's going to look like or concerned about the change, it can be very helpful to do digital renderings to show that change. So I just wanted to show that example. This is Rouleau Pond in Williamstown, Vermont. This is a dam that was impacted in the July flood tremendously, and it's a privately owned dam on it was built as a camp for someone. They wanted a pond at their camp, their summer camp. So they built it and put this, and they actually owned a granite quarry. And so they built it out of granite blocks and made this big dam. The other picture on the right is downstream below this dam is downtown Williamstown. And this is, so the dam did overtop and was damaged in the storm event. And all of that water and impact moved downstream, and there was a ton of damage in downtown Williamstown. They had to channelize the river here. this just shows the repair work after. But it's another example of, and these landowners, before the storm, they would have never considered removing their dam, and now they want nothing more than to remove the dam as soon as possible. So we're working with them to try and do it as speedily as we can. That being said, like it takes a long time to obtain the funding and do the design work and move through the design process and permitting. So again, like they're on edge and it could fail fully at any time, but we can only move as fast as we can move. I'm wondering what's, there we go. This is another picture of the same dam. So this dam actually had an emergency dam order completed because the damage was such that it needed to be repaired immediately to mitigate further failure. So, and it's a significant hazard dam. There's a high hazard, significant hazard, low hazard are the different designations of dams. And significant hazard means it's not going to kill anyone, but so there's no loss of human life, but the failure could cause economic loss, environmental damage, and disruption of lifeline facilities, which you saw in that picture below the town of Williamstown. So what they did here is we actually did another breach. We lowered the dam 4 feet this fall to just get us through the winter and keep the community safe. With the recognition, they got the funding from the state to do that work with the recognition that they are moving on a path towards removal. So they actually had to provide a letter of intent that like, we're supportive of this and we don't have the funds to pay for it, but the state had funds to pay for it on the condition that it would be removed. So yeah, just to summarize, dam removal outcomes: reconnected river allows for increased species and diversity of habitat. It improves community and climate resilience. It provides public safety and removes liability. It improves water quality and recreational opportunities, and it provides opportunities for education and outreach within communities, and support for watershed organizations around the state doing this good work. And this is my husband with a big brown trout right below the Pelletier Dam that is no longer. And these are my, some of these are my kids and my nephews fishing below another dam that was recently removed, where they still fish and catch even bigger, healthier fish. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Karina and Jennifer. We're going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A now. If you have a question, please you can either have your video on, give me a hands up. You can react with the hands up, or you can put in the chat. And we just ask that when you ask your question, you also give a brief introduction to yourself, what town you're from, any boards, committees you're on, any kind of related work you do, and then we can get into it. Yes, Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly Stettner. I live in Springfield, Vermont, below a humongous flood control dam. But I'm also the head of the Black River Action Team, an all-volunteer group down here, and I'm the new district manager for the Ottaquechee Natural Resources Conservation District. So lots of hats there. But in some of my, I share a lot of information on social media, especially about this workshop and other things that the CRJC are doing. And I've had some feedback from members of the community, usually in Ludlow, and some of the other harder hit communities. And the response to anything having to do with floodplain management is dig those rivers out. We've got to control these rivers. And I know I've shared a lot of other posts as well about what happens when you do that, and that flood management really should be a management type of approach, kind of a hybrid approach because there's different solutions to different scenarios. But to your point, that rivers are constantly moving and constantly moving, not just water, but stuff, sediment, leaves, sticks, trees, boulders, houses, whatever they can move. And I didn't know if I didn't realize this talk was going to be as much about insurance and the mitigation planning process, which I did find interesting anyway. It's always good to hear how that works and how things are determined. And I guess my basic point is, what would you say to somebody who has that, dig baby dig kind of a philosophy about how we should be handling our floodplains?
I don't know who
That
that
could be for
question is
anybody.
for.
Anybody
Like,
wants to tackle that.
I'll tackle it first, and then Jennifer can add if she wants. But Kelly, it's good to see you again, and thank you for that question. Yes, I hear it all the time too. It's like, if we can just dredge, and I think what's really important to communicate to those folks is that's ultimately just putting, so when you dredge a river, you channelize it and effectively straighten it, and that puts the pressure downstream. So it may be helping you in the short term, but it's ultimately just putting that pressure downstream. It's not a good answer. It's not the answer we need. And I think thinking about, so another thing that I try and think about with dam removals is so the dam itself is, blocking that water and building up all that sediment, which ultimately raises the water level. So that during flood events, the elevation is higher and there is a risk of flooding. When you remove a dam and all that sediment releases, or if you plan the dam removal, you take that sediment out, depending on the design, or some level of that sediment out, and put that back to where historically the channel went. And when you lower that channel, and this isn't through dredging in the straight channel aspect, but you're also opening up that area now for a floodplain on either side that the dam that the dam was blocking. So the river now can go out onto its banks and spread out and attenuate and dissipate. When you dredge a channel, you lose that. So you don't get the floodplain connection piece, which is really important.
Right. It's been a kind of a challenge to just explain. I guess I don't know if it's really my philosophy, but it seems to be the philosophy that's being embraced by and large, which is that right after a flood, yes, you've got to protect this infrastructure or that infrastructure. There's that emergency. We need to remove stuff from here and put it over there. But just having people who understand what a river's trying to do, so that when they take it from here, where's the best place to put it, that the river's not going to then use that as ammunition on the next property down. So just having excavators in there who know what they're doing around rivers, and then thinking long term and floodplains, and up further up into the hills too, looking at our streams that are coming down the mountains, and where can we allow them to jump their banks safely before they bring all that energy and material and water down to the big river that's already swollen.
Exactly. I can look for a link, Kelly. USGS did a really great study in Massachusetts of 5 different dam removals, and they have some video footage of hydrologic inundation mapping pre and post dam removal that just shows what the river does and what it would do, which is, I think it's a good visual tool. So
I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, that's the one thing Vermont has, is that river corridor system, which allows the rivers to migrate and to move. I know that we tried that in New Hampshire, especially after 2006, we had a river that had an avulsion, which changed course, and the result of that got a lot of people talking about, should it go back? Should it stay where it is? Kind of things like that. So yeah. But unfortunately, we did not, we weren't successful in getting the same type of corridor requirements in New Hampshire as Vermont does. So.
Do you track, Jennifer, or did you track the difference between inundation impact versus erosion impact, fluvial erosion impact in the state?
Not myself, but I think other people at Department of Environmental Services did.
Because that's like, we're actually working on that now in Vermont, and it's, you know, it's, the data says that we spend about 20% on the inundation piece as far as damages, but it's the other 80% that's the fluvial erosion impact, which is very significant.
Yeah.
Kelly, you made a point that actually brought up a question for me. So I'm from the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission, and as the RPC, we assist with the Connecticut River Joint Commissions. But as we all know, one thing that happens somewhere on the Connecticut River will likely impact things that happen elsewhere on the Connecticut River. So Karina and Jennifer, I was wondering if you had any examples of how towns have coordinated efforts or acknowledged mitigation, resilience, or response in coordinated efforts. Especially, you know, some places might feel like they are more galvanized to act, or they might have more resources to act, but really having more players involved could be helpful.
That's a good question. Trying to think. It just seems like, you know, I know that the communities are helping each other, but it's such a community-wide thing sometimes. I mean, I've worked with all the regional planning commissions over the years. And I just can't, I'll keep thinking about that.
I think something that's nice about the Connecticut River Joint Commissions is it is an organization that brings people from different towns together along the watershed, and not just New Hampshire, not just Vermont. It's really a cross-state effort.
Yeah, I know the cross state is a good key too.
And Majestic, in Vermont, we have the tactical basin plans, which are, I think, a good example of a coordinated effort to think about each watershed and have a plan for it on the larger scale. And, you know, that tactical basin, all of the communities that live along that basin are aware of that plan. And, you know, that's a place to look for future projects to come together on. So I think that's one good example. I see there's some questions in the chat, so I'm just turning to the chat. Isabel's asking if she knows what the timeline is for the Vermont Dam Safety Technical Staff. So the Ben Green, who Kelly is the dam safety engineer, and that's his contact, and the rulemaking has been postponed due to the flooding. They just were so busy with assessing the impacts of dams post-flooding that they have postponed the second phase of the rulemaking. And I believe that, and I don't quote me on this, but I believe that it has to be done by the end of 2024, but it could be 2025. I don't know the exact timeline there, but it has been postponed. And it's not because they're pushing it off, it's because they truly are very busy and overloaded. And I will say that this legislative session, we've been working to provide them with more staffing and additional dam safety procedures as far as reporting and inspections that may then, you know, add more complications to that second phase of rulemaking, but ultimately improve the process for everyone.
Thank you, Isabel, for the question. Does anyone else have any questions for our speakers today? Okay, I guess Jennifer and Karina, do you have any questions for each other?
No, but it's great to hear what's going on in New Hampshire, and great to make the connections with all of you folks.
Thank you all for joining. Again, this session has been recorded. So once we have it uploaded and clipped for everyone, we'll go ahead and send it out to registrants. So if you have any groups that you'd like to share it with, thought anything was very helpful, then you'll have that available for you. Again, thank you, Karina and Jennifer, for participating. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate all the expertise that you've given us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.